I was just talking to Dr. Robert Weiss, and he was with us a while ago. And when he was here, in addition to helping us through a basic guide to healing from sex, porn, and sex addictions, he introduced us to the term prodependence. Prodependence is a new concept in addiction healthcare, choosing to celebrate and value a caregiving loved one's willingness to support and stay connected with an addicted family member while promoting healing for the entire family. I just want to welcome Rob. He is an amazing man. You can find gazillions of things about him and from him on the internet, and we'll put some of that in the chat for you. But I'm going to let you listen to him guide you through this new approach to relationships. That is prodependence. So, Rob, we're really glad you're here. Looking forward to every word you have to say.
Thank you. I will do my best. Good afternoon or evening or morning, folks. My name is Dr. Rob Weiss. My name is Rob, and I'm a sex addict. I have spent the last 30 years. I entered SCA in December 10th, 1985. And then I started practicing as a licensed therapist in the sex addiction field in 1995. So I've been at this work 30 years, both personally, internally, and then later externally, because I have a PhD in human sexology. So I learned a lot about sex as a sex addict, and I learned a little bit about sex as a PhD. So now I know lots about it. And Susie, again, I want to confirm that you can see me and hear me just to get started. Okay, great. So a little bit about my work. I have open treatment centers all over the world, mostly in the US, for sex addiction, both in men and women. I've opened them for the US military and in Singapore, a bunch in Southeast Asia, but mostly here in the US. My history is in my recovery, writing 10 or 11 books on sex addiction and compulsive sexuality, and how men can resolve the issue of cheating in a woman that they have cheated on. I'm very grateful to the promises, because everything that happened to me and everything I did in my addiction has become and translated into my ability to help others. This is how I do service, by not so much one-on-one, but by using this platform I have to be able to offer information to you about recovery. And I'm glad to come back anytime I speak for 12-step meetings, programs, wherever you want. I would say, and Susie, I don't know if you can say this, but this is not a 12-step meeting in the sense that I'm not here for a primary share. I am here as a therapist. I'm here as a kind of like a workshop leader. I will talk about my program. I will talk about my books. And so just to be clear, I'm not breaking through the traditions here. That's how this was set up. If you want to reach me, and we'll start in a second, you can see my email there. I also wished I'd put up there a pretty busy podcast. We have over 1 million downloads. So I'll tell you a little bit about that work later. I run a treatment center now here in LA, and I hope to retire, Susie, in not too long. So let's go through this. This is going to be a discussion. I made it about, I think about an hour, a little bit less. I tried to cut it down a little bit. And then what I'd appreciate, Susie, and let me know, is how you want to do questions. What I would appreciate is if you just read them to me, and I can answer them when it's time for questions. How does that sound? Okay.
That's normally we have people raise their hands, but it might be more efficient to do it if people put their questions in the chat, and I'll convey them to you. Okay.
Yeah, because we're not in a meeting, so we can just make a list of questions. So what else do I want to tell you? I wrote my PhD dissertation on the topic of codependence. I have strong feelings about it being problematic as a model. And that's really what this talk is about, to talk about some of the challenges with codependency for family and loved ones of addicts. And this isn't just sex addicts, it's family and loved ones of addicts in general, who I don't think we've given a very good shake. So I'm going to flip through this by hand. We got it out as best we can. So I want to start with this slide, and nod your head, Susie, if you can see me. That's what I want to make sure. So I want to read this caregiving scenario. I'm going to read it like it's me, okay? So my spouse, husband, wife, whatever it is, has cancer, and yet they are resistant to treatment. We have 3 kids under the age of 14. In response to this family crisis, I push aside my own needs and desires. I work 2 jobs. I stop self-care. I stop recreation. I gain weight. I lose sleep. I worry all the time. What's going to happen to my family? We never expected cancer to come along. I'm sick. I'm overwhelmed. I'm irritable. I'm vigilant, and I'm afraid. It's all I can think about. I've read every book on cancer, gone to every group I can find, trying to gather information. In this situation, how do you think my friends, my family members, and my therapist would advise and support me? Do you think they would understand that my family and I have been victimized by the experience of cancer, that we weren't expecting it, that we never imagined it, and yet it was visited on our family? Now, let's look at this scenario. My spouse, male, female, boy, girl, husband, wife of 15 years, is addicted to opioids, and yet they're resistant to treatment. We have 3 kids under the age of 14. And in response to this crisis, I push aside my own needs and desires. I work 2 jobs. I stop self-care and recreation. I gain weight. I lose sleep, and I worry all the time. I'm sick. I'm overwhelmed. I'm irritable. I'm vigilant and afraid. And it's all I can think about. I've read every book on addiction. I've read every single piece of information. I've joined groups because I want to know as much about it as I possibly can. How do you think my family, my friends, my therapist would advise and support me in this situation? Don't you think, or do you think they understand that I have been victimized by this scenario? We never expected the opioids. We never expected addiction. We never thought something like this would happen. And yet here we are. My suspicion and my experience is that they would manage and handle it in very different ways. And why is that? Why do we treat a caretaker scenario in a way that presents love, support? In the first scenario, I think with a medical issue, you might call me an angel. You might say, what a brave person to give up everything they have in order to help this family member and help their family with cancer. But if I give myself up entirely and do anything I can to, including giving up myself to help my family with addiction, then I'm called codependent. And I have a problem with that. I believe the difference has to do with the fact that addicts' families have always been stigmatized by association with the addict. You know, it's okay to say, oh, that poor family, they have a cancer problem. But to say, oh, that family, they have addiction, completely stigmatizes them. And mental health, by the way, as well. And we have a documented history in the addiction field of being blamed and shamed by professionals. And I said I just did my dissertation on this, so I want to quote you a little bit of what one of our addiction historians, William Weiss, said. And this was about the mid-20th century, 50s, 60s. And he said, the general view of the alcoholic wife depicted in early AA and psychotherapy literature was one of a woman who is neurotic, sexually repressed, dependent, man-hating, domineering, mothering, guilty, masochistic, and or hostile and nagging. The typical therapist view of the wife of an alcoholic at that time generally was, I'd drink too if I was married to her. To me, this defines shaming the victim. And just to say it, I do believe strongly that partners, families, and loved ones of addicts have been victimized by the disease of addiction. I don't think they're walking around as victims, poor me, I'm victim of this and that and the everything. But when you are not expecting a crisis to occur in your family, and it does, you have been victimized by that experience. Now, over the past 35 years, we've seen a lot of addiction treatment models for addicts. Trust me, I've been in the field in treatment centers for almost 30 years. And I can tell you that when it comes to acknowledged overarching models for the treatment of family and loved ones and spouses, despite all the work we've done in creating, and I could list them, different methods and ways of looking at treating addicts, we have only one for the families of addicts. And that model is called codependency. And codependency looks to loved ones as being part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And to me, calling a family member who's been victimized by addiction a part of the problem is also a more sophisticated version of shaming the victim. Why do we do this? one of the things that I thought a lot about and I would share with you is part of the problem with codependency and the models that we've had before is they basically looked at the idea of addiction as being in part driven and supported by the families and loved ones of addicts. In other words, they are and who they are and the way they are and their family histories are driving the addiction problem forward. I think that was a mistake. I think the way we should be looking at it is that family members and loved ones have been deeply affected by the crisis of someone that they love in addiction. And guess what? When there's a crisis, people act like crazy people. You know, if my child died, if I was hit by a truck or my family member, I would do all kinds of crazy things. And you wouldn't say to me, what's wrong with him that he's acting so crazy? You would say, I completely understand because look at what's happening to his family. In other words, I think the problem is that we have not looked at partners, loved ones, and families of all addicts as being affected by the crisis, and thereby we have judged and blamed and see them as contributing to the problem rather than having been deeply affected by the problem. So here are the big four books on codependency that defined and dominated the field and the concept of codependence in the 1980s. They laid out the underlying concepts of that model, which have pretty much unchanged since these books were published. So you have Claudia Black's It Will Never Happen to Me in 1982. You have in Robin Norwood's, got to remember this one, Women Who Love Too Much in 1985. You have Codependent No More in 1986. And you have a book by Dr. Tim Cermak, I think, which is also in 86. And the reason I mention him is he was a doctor, a physician who worked very, very, very hard to get codependency in the diagnosis journals so that as a therapist, if you tell me your client is depressed, and you're in Ohio and I am in London, I know what depressed is because we have the same scientific criteria. I know that 4 out of 5 things in my book says that this person's depressed. You have the same book. You know that 4 out of 5 things, if you look in your book, means the person's depressed. So we are completely aligned on what depression means if that concept is included in therapy literature. However, codependency has never, ever been included in codependency literature. It has never been researched to the point that it made the level of a diagnosis, ever, ever. There has been no research published or created on the concept of codependency since 1994. So what are we really talking about? A model that has no definition, no proof, and has never been acknowledged by the medical or psychological or addiction community as a formal way of treating people. The problem with this is that if I am in London and you're in Ohio and you say, oh, my client is codependent, and I say, I think they're codependent too, what does that mean? Because we have hundreds of books on codependency. Does codependency, as you look at it, mean book number 207 from the 90s, but I'm looking at book number 101 from the 80s? We have no universal way of talking about this because it has never been accepted as a scientific, medical, or addiction-focused formal diagnosis. Addiction is. If you look at addiction, I can say, well, 4 out of 5 these things or 3 out of 7 of these things define an addict. We both know we're talking about the same thing, but we do not have this in codependency because codependency has never been more than a pop culture notion. That's it. It has never risen to the level of a therapeutic diagnosis, but it rushed into the field in the 1980s and 90s, in part because of what was going on in the culture. The me generation was looking to be individuals, to separate, to be focused on ourselves rather than move toward community. And all of these books told women in particular, because women read 95% of all self-help books, it told them that their empathy, their compassion, their nurturing, and their focusing on, as a community, the problem at hand was wrong. And they were not going to break through that glass ceiling unless they acted more like men. And this was particularly true at that time because women were very focused on becoming successful in that way. I think of the movie 9 to 5, which is about women pushing dumb men out of the way so that they can succeed in the workplace. These books said, you don't have to do that. Just be more assertive, more individualistic, more aggressive, and meaning basically be more like a man. And while that helped in the business setting, I think it was extremely problematic in the personal setting in terms of our relationships. So Codependent No More sold over 11 million copies and was translated into 16 languages. Women bought 95% of these, as they buy all self-help books at the time, and they continue to do so today. By the way, women who buy my books, because 95% self-books are bought by women, read these books and they throw them at the men that they're involved with. Men, and some men as well, but mostly women. And I don't mean to only talk about heterosexual models. It's simply the most frequent one that I see. Although certainly we have convinced a whole lot of men that they're codependent as well. As of 1990, there were 102 books with some form of the word codependency in the title. As of 2018, when I did my PhD, there were 340 books with some form of the word codependency in the title. Which one is right? As I said, we have no research. It's never been included in our diagnosis manuals. Now, we have had all along a diagnosis, which I'm not going to go into, called pathological dependency, which pretty much met how we look at codependency, but much more seriously, that I am unable to function or get through the day unless I am completely and utterly dependent on you. It is sort of an extreme version of how we look at codependency, but that is in our diagnostic manuals, that is universally accepted, that does have criteria that we can look at, and research validates it. The reason codependency never made it into any of the formal literature is because we already had this diagnosis, which could be used, and so it was turned down. Now, here are book titles number 338, 339, and 340. What has not been said? Loves Me Not, Codependency, Codependency for Dummies, The End of Codependency, Conquering Codependency, Codependency Recovery Guide. We have spent 30 years talking about this, and I bet you, and excuse me if I devalue anyone, but that every one of these books is written by a therapist or by an individual who has had experience of codependence, or what they call codependence, and they're writing about their experience. All the way back to Melody Beatty and Codependent No More and Claudia Black's book. These were women who I respect and I know personally, but in truth, they were writing about having grown up with abusive fathers and then marrying abusive alcoholic men. And while that was true in their experience and many people's experience, that doesn't mean that you can diagnose someone with that. And I think there's a reason why we've written 340 books about this issue, which is we don't have a definition or clarity about exactly what it is, because every book says something else. What bothers me in particular about this is not only how it affects us, it bothers me how it affects, in my world, my students. What am I teaching them about how to help the families and loved ones of addicts? Which version out of the 340 books do I teach them? Because there is no universal in the therapy field, the addiction field, concept, belief, or medical addiction diagnosis of codependency. Again, it is a pop culture notion. So, and this sets my hair on fire, and I don't have any hair. I think part of the problem is that codependency has looked at loved ones as addicts. So us loving partners, those supportive family members, are seen as being addicted to those that we love. But wait a minute, that's how we treat addicts. Do you think what partners and spouses and loved ones of addicts need is to be looked at as addicts? I don't think so. I don't think they are addicts. And if you look back at Lois Wilson and the beginning of the Al-Anon program, it never said that you were addicted to your husband, that you were addicted to your wife. What it said was you were obsessed with their drinking. You were obsessed with their using. And I completely agree and understand that, because when someone has cancer, I become obsessed with it. My whole life becomes about it. When someone is dying or struggling who I love with addiction, of course, my entire life is going to become about it. But I'm not obsessed with the person I love. I just love them. What I'm obsessed with is the craziness and the addiction that is driving our family or me into the ground. So in addiction treatment, I do and run a program. I've done addiction treatment, as I said, many years, created it, written about it, all that stuff. And this is basically what we do with addicts. We explore the problem with them. We confront their unbelievable denial and their distortions. We clearly help them understand what they do, how they do it, how it's affected other people, and all that. We provide accountability, much like a 12-step program. Call me, reach out to me, build a group, all that stuff. We confront their acting out, show them the degree of a problem that it is, and then we build support groups for accountability and structure. And then we do it over and over and over again because addicts need repeated lessons about how to recover. I don't think partners need to explore their problem. They know what the problem is. It's the addicted person. I don't think they're in denial. I think they know exactly what's going on in front of them. I think they know what the problem is. I think they're trying as best they can to contain this problem. I don't think they're acting out. I think they're doing the best they can to try to help a loved one survive with addiction. And yes, you guys need support groups and accountability, but I think that's universal for all of us in recovery. So, do partners and spouses and loved ones have a problem? Yes, they're obsessed with the addiction in another person. But that doesn't mean, and I think you'll find that spouses of addicts and family members of addicts don't particularly appreciate being in addiction treatment. They need something completely different. Partners, family members, and loved ones need support. They need guidance. They need nurturing. They need a peaceful solution to the crisis that they've been in. And they certainly don't need someone to come along and say, oh, you're a partner, you're a spouse. Well, I know what's wrong with you. You are a codependent. First of all, I don't know how many of you, and you have different names, secondary school, high school, college. I can only use American definitions. So I don't think any one of us finished high school with a complete knowledge of how to work with addiction and what it means. I don't think many of us finished college with any kind of understanding of how to work with addiction or how to do treatment, because some of us were science majors and math majors, and they didn't teach us much about this. And yet, we expect a family member or a loved one to know exactly what to do and how to do it when they're dealing with a crisis of addiction in a loved one. And if they don't do it in the right way, then we see that it's something wrong with them. What about they did their best? They just didn't know how to fix it. But when they get involved with people like me who are addiction professionals, then we can help guide them to the more effective ways. I will never say that a spouse did it the wrong way, tried to help someone get sober. I will say that they may have not have done it in the most effective way. But how would they have known that? Who would have taught them that? It's people like us, addiction recovery specialists, who come in and say, boy, you love this person. You really want to help this person. Didn't go so well the way you tried to do it. Let's now work together to make it better. So, if there is no codependency, and I do not believe that there is, then why do spouses and family members and loved ones of addicts give up their entire lives to fix and rescue an addict? And to me, there can be no other answer than they love them. I stay with somebody who is an addict, not because of my pathological trauma background. I stay with them because I love them. And I speak to hundreds of couples who deal with sex addiction. I have treated 1,000 men who are sex addicts. And I can tell you that you can look at these partners and say, oh my God, why are they staying with them after what they've done with them? And they did this to them and they did that to them. And they called this love, but then they did that. I know that. I'm so sorry. That's painful and it needs to be healed. But they still look at their partners and family members and loved ones and love them. Just because someone has hurt you, just because someone is consistently hurting you, you may need to set boundaries and move away from them. You may need to stop talking to them. You may need to do whatever you need to do to protect and provide safety for yourself, even if it is or isn't helpful to the addict. But you don't change your behavior in order to influence the addict's behavior. We set a boundary for ourselves. The reason people who've been abused and hurt stay in problematic relationships is because they still love the person that they're in the relationship with. And everything they do to try to make it better, whether it's helpful or not, comes from love. Now, do people act out their past trauma when they're going through a crisis? You bet. If I was in a crisis with my child who was very, very ill, I would probably be crazy. I would give up all my stuff. I would, always set in a medical model. And I would probably reenact some issues of my past trauma. This is what human beings do when we regress, when we're in a crisis. In other words, If a child's grandmother dies and they're 5, maybe they were completely over with bedwetting for a long time. They no longer do that. But what we know in my field is that when a child goes through a crisis, they regress into earlier states of functioning, meaning that that child may start wetting their bed again because of the crisis that they're going through. Adults revert to or regress to previous levels of functioning too when we are in a crisis. So might we show evidence of past trauma or past problematic issues that happened to us? Of course. Is that because our trauma is leading to or driving our desire to be with this person or help them? I don't think so. So I'm going to skip that. We don't have a video for you today. So I wrote a new model. It is 180 degrees the opposite of codependency. What I created was a model based on strength. In other words, if you love someone and you're attached to someone, that is a strength. If you are trying to help and save and rescue them from dying in front of you or losing their family or losing everything they have, and you try to help, and I use this word on purpose, rescue them, I think that is one of the most loving things that anyone can do. What a gift to stand by me in my worst crisis of my life and still see the good in me. And one of the things I say to addicts is that one of the gifts of having spouses and loved ones stay in our lives, one of the reasons they hang on to us is because they still have the hope that we don't have for ourselves. They still see the good in us that we can't see in our own active addiction. They are holding on to the hope for the future. So when the spouse or loved one of an active addict walks into my office, I see them as someone in a profound life crisis that is not of their own making, and one that anyone would have little ability to solve on their own. By definition, they have been victimized and betrayed by the active addict's behavior, who is most often someone with whom they shared a deep and trusting bond. And as all of you know, especially the partners of sex addicts, that our trust is not broken so much by the addictive behavior, not by the sex, but it's the lying, the manipulation, the seduction, the lack of intimacy, the gaslighting that nearly all addicts employ, because what we want to do is keep acting out. So we blame you, we shame you, we undermine you in order to keep doing what we want to do. And that destroys you. Now, I run a treatment center called Seeking Integrity, and I think we do pretty amazing work, and I have done this for a long time. And one of the things that we do in treatment is we ask a spouse or a partner or a loved one to send us a letter saying, what have you been through with this addict? What have you gone through? What have you had to deal with? Talking about the problems. And I read these letters. I've read hundreds of them. And you would think that a spouse of a sex addict would write, you had sex with this person, you had sex with that person, you went to strip clubs, you took all this money from the family, you gave me a disease. You would think, considering that my clients are in treatment for sex addiction and I treat men, that their spouses would be writing letters about how destroyed they've been about the sexual or romantic behavior outside the relationship. That is not true. 80% of what those people write me about, oops, did I lose you? I lost something. Hold on a second.
You're okay.
Sorry about that. Not sure what happened. Oh, there we go. So 80% of what I read in the letters from you spouses and partners and family members is, and 80% of these letters, and I read them all the time, is about lack of intimacy, destruction of our connection, not being vulnerable, not being present for the family, being disconnected, not sharing their truth, hiding, being secretive, being dishonest. 80% of the letters being abusive. 80% of the letters about that, and 20% are about the sexual behavior. So I know what really breaks a spouse or a loved one is not the sexual acting out. That is the tip of the iceberg. What breaks them is the relationship that has fallen apart, or it has never been as strong as it might have been, or they thought it was. So I believe that people who are involved with active addicts are in the middle of a crisis. And that means they need crisis counseling. They don't need analysis. They don't need exploratory treatments. They don't need evaluations of past trauma, because those things feel blaming and intrusive, and they feel, I can't read that word, something else, because Susie's on top of it, and counterintuitive and distracting. No, Susie, you're doing great. So understand that the way I view partners and spouses and family members of addicts as being in a crisis. And when we treat people in a crisis, here are some of the basic rules. We treat them in the here and now, period. We don't look back at the past. We don't look at things that happened to them. We don't give them evolving models like codependency, because those things confuse and overwhelm somebody who is in a crisis. What we say is keep it simple. What crisis intervention work says is help the person find concrete direction toward how to go forward. In other words, how do you get through the night? How do you get through the next day? How are you going to get through the week? What are you going to do to learn support? Our job, in my belief system, with someone who's in a crisis, like the addict or like the partner or spouse of a loved one of an addict, is that they are needing, because like everyone in a crisis, simple things, clear things, not complex things, education, direction, support, hope. Those are the things that spouses and partners need. They don't need to go back and say, oh, well, look at my history and all the problems that I've created in driving the addiction forward. You know, if you want to look at that, wait till the person's been sober a year. Wait till that person is not in the middle of a crisis. And if that person comes back and says, you know, I'd like to look at how my behavior created problems when the addiction was going on, I'm glad to do therapy with them and help them with that. And yes, there are issues there. But someone who's in the crisis of a loved one's active addiction or early recovery, they're not ready to look at themselves. No one in a crisis is ready to look at themselves. And that confuses them and makes them feel, and I think this is the part that I feel most strongly about, is the idea of remorse. You know, when my dog died, I thought, I wish I played with him more. I wish we'd thrown a bone around more. I wish I had let him sleep on my bed a little more often. In other words, I feel remorse when I have a loss, just like all the other issues around grief. When my father died, I thought, I wish we'd had that conversation. I wish we'd worked through some of those things. We have remorse when there is a loss or a crisis in our lives. And what remorse does is it makes us look at ourselves and say, what did I do wrong? That's part of grief. I don't think playing on that emotion by saying, yes, your partner is an addict, so let's look at what you did wrong, is loving or fair. I think it is playing on the remorse that someone is already feeling. And that, I think, is a form of hurting them in ways that is unnecessary. I can redirect how you help the addict in your life without your having to look at your whole history and how you have a part in it. And I can help you just figure it out. And later on, we can look at the other parts if you're in a more stable place where that person is sober or they're no longer in your life. So the way I wrote about this, and the current book, I rewrote it because they let me, is a book called Prodependence, The Myth of Codependency, because I do believe that from a therapy perspective, that codependency is a myth. We have no science behind it. It is not an accepted diagnosis. And what you think of it and I think of it are completely different things. So this is how I look at this language that gets thrown at us. Codependence says we are enmeshed. I say under prodependence, we are deeply involved. Codependence says you're externally focused. You're focused on that other person. I would say prodependence, you are focused on the problem, which is that person, that situation, what's going on in your life. Codependence says you're enabling. I would say you're being as supportive as you can. Codependence says you're just coming from fear. I would say, you bet. If you're living with an active addict, you better be concerned about what the next day is going to bring. Prodependence says we don't have healthy boundaries as family members. I would say we will do anything to care for a loved one. If you are sick physically, I will lay down my life if you're my family member, my son, my daughter, my husband, my wife, to help you survive, what is wrong with me being willing to lay down my life to help you live through an addiction? What is the difference? We say that partners and codependent family members can't stop fixing. I would say that they will do whatever they can to help. Codependency says that they're obsessed with the addict. I would say that they're determined to protect the family, and their obsession is with the problem, the addiction, not the person that they love. Codependency says they're living in denial. I would say, oh, they are unwilling to give up on a loved one. They know what all the problems are. They can see them right in front of them, but they are not willing to give up. They're not in denial. They know exactly what's happened. They may be hopeful beyond the way that situation could offer anybody hope. But when you love somebody and you're trying to help them and they're falling off a cliff, I suggest that denial, meaning or the thought that I'm not sure I can get there to help them, that's a natural, understandable issue. We say that partners and spouses, why are they so angry all the time? Angry, angry, angry. And I would say, of course they're angry because they're terrified that they're going to have more out of control losses. And I would tell you a little bit about a little therapy trick. When people are angry, angry is something we call a defense, meaning there is something underneath that anger that is driving it. Anger is not the primary emotion. What is underneath anger is fear and sadness. I get angry because it gives me a sense of control, because it gives me a sense of being empowered. I'm going to dive into that problem. I'm going to hate that person because of what they're doing to me. But what's underneath that is I am so, so sad. And I am so, so afraid. And the way I feel like I can gather myself together and move beyond that is with my anger. Codependency says that we are controlling and nagging. I will say that we are doing whatever we can to try to make the situation different, even if it isn't nice. Will I nag you and nag you and nag you to stop going out after 6 o'clock when I know that what you've been doing is going to massage parlors? Will I start to control you and say, you don't get to leave and I'm going to manage the money? Of course, because I am trying to change the situation and I can't. You put me in a situation that is deeply important to me and I can't change it, and watch me become controlling and nagging and doing whatever I can to change it. Of course I would. We say that codependents are hypervigilant. They're focused on everything that's going wrong. And I would say, of course they are, because they're anticipating problems that have already happened. And if I see somebody go up into that room and close the door and turn on the computer, you bet I'm going to be vigilant about what are they doing in there? What's going on? And maybe do I need to read their browser or any of those kinds of things? You know, with a sex addict, they took money out of the bank. Were they using for sex workers? Maybe I better control the money. Of course. That's where we go. Now, let's see what the next slide is. And okay, so I want to just say something about this from an Al-Anon perspective, because this is my favorite story. Of course, I made it up and I wrote it. So of course it'd be my favorite story. I'm a little narcissistic in case you didn't notice. I've had 20 years to work on it, and now I understand my narcissism. So much 20 years of therapy. But in any case, I want to tell you this story. So there's a woman who has an alcoholic husband, and during the day, he drinks to the point where he has lost jobs. He's been arrested for driving drunk, and their children have been driven home by him when he was drinking. So her children were driven home from school when he was drinking. She needed her husband to work. She needed her husband to take care of those children. She needed her husband to not be arrested. And so this is what she did. She saw her husband came home at 4 o'clock from work, and she had an ice cold bottle of vodka on the dining room table. And she said to him, if you can come home and not drink and not lose your job, not drink and get arrested for drinking, not drink with my children in the car, then you can drink all you want after 4 o'clock in the afternoon at home. I don't care. Can you imagine what we would call that under a codependency model? In my belief system, she was doing something called harm reduction. She was trying to save her family from an extremely difficult situation by keeping that guy working and taking care of her kids and not getting arrested. Did her putting that bottle on the table solve the problem? No. Did it work forever? No. She got a year where that man was not arrested, kept working, and took care of those kids without being drunk. Now, eventually, he started drinking all day long, and they got back into the same problems because that way she tried to handle it, and she did the best she could. And I think she did a great job. It didn't solve the problem of alcoholism. And so she needed to go to me and said, I've done the best I can. These bottles at 4 o'clock don't seem to be working. Now he's not listening to me anymore. What do I do? And I will say, you did a great job in trying to fix that problem. Didn't work, but you did a great job. And that worked for a period of time to keep your family safe. Now that it's not working, why don't we work together towards sobriety? I think that is a much more loving and compassionate way to look at spouses who, in many cases, are just trying to keep the people they love and their families together. So I hate this thing that we say, which is, oh, well, if that person, that partner, that family member, if they just went to work on their stuff, their issues, their problems, if they don't do that, then they're just going to marry or get involved with someone who's just like that person. And I'll say to you, absolutely. They're going to get involved with another version of that person, whether they work on themselves or not, because twos don't marry sevens. Meaning, if I'm an emotional, and this, guys, you know this, if I'm an emotional mess, crisis, drama, all that stuff, and I want to look at my spouse, I want a spouse that's cool and stable, and I look at that person who's a 7 emotionally, they've got their life together and they're doing well. Do you know what, as a 2, I say to myself, and I've heard this a million times, they're boring. And when you're a 7 who has your life together and you're doing really well and you're pretty stable and you're looking for a partner, you look at that 2 and say, they're nuts. So these people will never marry each other. We will always get involved with people who are at the similar level of our functioning. That's how we're made. However, we can get involved with people in informed ways. We can go to 12-step programs and have accountability and say to our recovery posse, well, this is the person I want to date, and they're alcoholic and they're a heroin addict and they're still living with their wife, but oh, they're so cute. And we're going to say to them as a recovering person, that's probably not a good idea to go out with that person. And if you're working a program, you won't. We can say to that person, you know what? If you're going to choose somebody to love, just make sure that they're in recovery and they're in therapy. Make sure, and this is Rob's rule, you can love me, you can hurt me, you can let me down, you can disappoint me, as long as you can come back and own your stuff. If you can come back to me and say, that was my part, you can hurt me, you can let me down, because it isn't me who's the crazy person. So when I get involved with people, if I were out there looking for someone, I wouldn't expect that they're going to be the perfect hero or whatever. I would expect that they're going to have issues. But what I would want in someone I'm getting involved with is the awareness that since I'm going to get involved with someone who probably has issues, I should make choices in combination with other people who may be able to see it more clearly. And I really need to make sure that they are in enough recovery to be able to own their stuff. And I believe that 2 people who are 2s are going to get to 4 or 6 much more quickly than they are on their own. I believe that more marriages could have been saved in the 90s had we not told people, well, you got to go out there and be more of yourself and become stronger, and then you'll pick better relationships, and you should leave this person with their addiction and let them struggle. And I don't think we want to necessarily leave with someone with their addiction. I think we want to help them. But the message of codependency has said, separate, individuate, and do it on your own. By the way, I'll say very quickly, that codependency does not apply across cultures. Codependency is great for Eurocentric culture. But when I go into African American, Hispanic culture, Native cultures, they don't look at someone in a crisis in a family they don't encourage moving away and working on yourself. In fact, that would be considered selfish. Many, if not most other cultures encourage people who are in a crisis to move toward the community and toward their loved one and have the community wrap their arms around those people and help them. The me generation said, go off and be a better person and get stronger. I don't think we're in that place anymore. I think we're in a place that connection matters, attachment is what is important, and we don't blame people for holding on to the love they have. We celebrate them, and we see that as a strength. So, a few questions about the model. Should people put up with violence or abuse? No. I'm not saying that you have to stay with a person, that just because you love them, you should let them yourself being abused. None of that. I say you set boundaries, and we set boundaries not for anyone else. We set them for ourselves. And then if there's one that's crossed that is unacceptable, we get ourselves out of there. We still love them, but we don't need to be around them. What about 12-step programs? I'm a huge Al-Anon fan, and I'm not a codependency or CODA fan for obvious reasons. I do think that Al-Anon got somewhat co-opted by seeing, it took a note from codependency and said, oh, these people are addicted to the addict and they're part of the problem. I don't think Al-Anon is entirely about that. I think it's about partners and family members gaining their own strength. And I would send someone to Al-Anon without question, but first, I would make sure that they have a sense within themselves that the addiction is not my fault. And I want every partner who's here and family member and loved one to hear from me that there is nothing that can you tell I'm passionate about this? There is nothing that anyone can do to make somebody else drink. There is nothing that I can do to make someone sexually act out. And any of you partners and spouses who are blaming yourself, take it off the table. Because I can make someone miserable. I can nag them. I can gain 300 pounds. I can never have sex with them. I can say nasty things to them. I can make them miserable. And they can go out, they can get a divorce. They can go play golf. They can spend more time with friends. They can encourage us to go to marital counseling. The choice to go use or drink or act out because I'm in an unhappy family or partner relationship is the addict's choice and the addict's choice alone. I can do a lot of things with my unhappiness with you other than go drink, use, or sexually act out. That is my choice. And that is my biggest issue with codependency is how dare we go to partners and family members and say, well, if you just did it differently, maybe they would drink less, or maybe they wouldn't drink or get to recovery faster. It's not our fault. We didn't create the problem and we can't fix the problem. The problem is the addict's problem. We can take care of ourselves and acknowledge that it's okay to love them and love them in healthier ways, but don't blame us for the love that we give. So a few resources from me, and then I'm going to take questions. Some of the many books that I've written, Going Across, Cruise Control, which is the only book for gay men who are sex addicts. I wrote it because I am a gay man and the cultures are very different. Sex Addiction 101 is about sex addiction. Out of the Doghouse is a book for men to understand how to fix cheating in a woman that they have loved. No man I've ever met knows how to fix the problem of cheating in a woman they love. None of them. Prodependence is the book about this, and there's also a version for therapists. So I wrote 2 of them. Tammy and I, who's my kind of coworker friend, we do the podcast Overcoming Betrayal and Addiction. Sex, Love, and Addiction has over 1 million downloads. That is my current podcast. If you're interested in understanding sex addiction from a variety of perspectives and other professionals, I encourage you to listen to Sex, Love, and Addiction. And you can also find me on Psychology Today.